I apologize first for my voice. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second CCSA talk, summer semester 2023. I'm Sara Honarmand Ebrahimi, and I'm a Humboldt Research Fellow at Art History Institute, Goethe University, Frankfurt. For those of you who are joining us today for the first time, Center for Critical Studies in Architecture, CCSA, is a research cluster between Art History Institute, Goethe University, Frankfurt, Technical University Darmstadt, and German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt. We are very happy to have Dr. Boddice today with us, who is joining us from Tampere University in Finland. My colleague Cigdem Talu is going to introduce Rob in a minute, but before that, I would like to mention just that Cigdem and I are organizing an online conference in June, which is going to take place between 22nd and 23rd. And this talk and the previous talk are preliminary to this conference, and we will share the program in the chat box. Thank you, Rob, again for accepting our invitation. And I also would like to thank Daniela and Frederike for accepting to host these talks in collaboration with the CCSA. To you, Cigdem.
Very happy to be introducing Rob. Rob Boddice is a senior research fellow at the Academy of Finland Center for of Excellence in the History of Experiences at Tampere University. He has previously held long-term positions at the Center for the History of Emotions in Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, and at the Languages of Emotions Excellence Cluster at Freie Universität Berlin. He is the author and editor of 13 books, including Knowing Pain, A History of Sensation, Emotion, and Experience, which was the most recent one, came out in 2023. Emotion, Sense, Experience, co-written with Mark Smith, and a History of Feelings from 2019, and the History of Emotions from 2018. Stage is yours, Rob.
Thanks so much, Cigdem and Sara, and for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak. Actually, Knowing Pain, it arrived today. I just got it. So it's still fresh. It's got that new baby smell. Anyway, I would like, before I share my screen, I'm going to get some identity issues out of the way because I want to stress that I am not, by training, an architectural historian. I'm not even an urban historian. So that being said, I am lots of other things. And if I just put this up, change this around, hopefully in due course you'll see. So what am I if I'm not these things? I am an historian of emotions, senses, and experience, as evidenced by the little book that Cigdem mentioned. I'm an historian more broadly of the human being, and in that vein, I'm a biocultural historian. And being these things, I accept that it's impossible to access what I want to access unless I appreciate the material environments in which human beings live and have lived. So my premise, and this is going to be an extreme reduction, which I hope you'll forgive, but my premise is that human experience is always embodied and always emplaced. There is no human experience that is entirely socially or culturally constructed, that dwells entirely in the realm of text or discourse. And likewise, there's no human experience that's entirely biologically autonomous and automatic, that's cut off from its context and running as if by evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology logics. So to underscore that point, there is no experience that is unmediated. That's my sort of main impetus, that all experience is mediated. So if I talk of lived experience, and that's a complicated two-word phrase that will pop up from time to time, I'm not actually, I'm not chiming with the German phenomenologists about Erlebnis. I know that German phenomenologists, when they're translated into English, Erlebnis becomes lived experience. But that's not what I'm doing. Instead, I'm working with an Anglophone theoretical position that doesn't actually recognize the difference or the distinction between Erlebnis and Erfahrung. So what do I mean? Lived experience refers to mediated, meaningful, subjective and intersubjective and collective feelings of how things are. So how an experience is for a person or group depends on a lot of things in entanglement. It depends on the material environment, memory, belief systems, knowledge systems, depends on political framing, conceptual repertoire, and situated and emotional and sensory practices, and all of these things in a kind of dynamic relation with the multiply plastic affordances of the situated body and brain. So I'm sorry, that's really a mouthful, but that's kind of the ingredients I'm always conjuring with when I'm talking about lived experience, which is very, very far from what's usually meant by Erlebnis. Anyway, the point is that if I want to mine the history of lived experience in these terms, I have to take all of these things into account in historical context. So this obliges me to appreciate not just the when of history, but also the how and the where, as well as the stuff of history. Okay, so this is by way of preface. More specifically, in recent times, I have been inspired by this book on the screen, Nikolas, Rose and Fitzgerald's Urban Brain. And they begin this book with an observation. They say that thinking of human neurobiology today requires us to think of a dynamic interplay in which human bodies and human environments constrain each other, mark each other, intermingle in an awkward, shuffling embrace. I quite like the dancing metaphor. What this means for historians, and neither of these people is an historian, this is at the heart of the challenges and the prospects for the further development of the relationship between, say, urban history and the histories of emotions and senses and experience. But this dynamic, this shuffle that they mentioned, this biocultural embrace, it's not only about the constraints that they put on each other. It's not only about making impressions. It's not only an awkward dance. I think often it's also a productive, constructive dynamic. And in certain contexts, it seems as if everything moves, as it were, effortlessly. It seems as if things develop, as it were, naturally. And then this dynamic of human neurobiology and the environment appears deceptively simple, graceful even, but certainly invisible. And I think we need to tease out what's going on in this invisibleness. And so I ask, what's the object of research here? Is it the city itself? Or is it the human experience that both produces and is formed by the city? Now, I like to smash binary dualism, so I'll break this one as well. Collapse the space between the material environment of the city and the experiences of those who live in it, and argue instead that while a biocultural approach does not allow us to ring-fence bits of the human as purely biological or automatic, It also negates any attempt to ring-fence bits of the city as purely material or objective or entirely the product of culture. So the life of a city's built environment, its spaces and passages, is inseparable from the dynamic engagement of the brain-body systems that are moving through it. The city is in fact inconceivable without those bodies and brains. So to that end, the city becomes a source for the research of human experience, just as human experience reveals the situated city. And I really want to resist here the temptation to introduce a direction, a causal direction in this relationship. In this recent book, sorry, it's blurry, but Katie Barclay and Jade Riddle's recent book, they begin by saying that emotions do significant work in producing cities. And I say the reverse is just as true. And so while they say that, to quote them, the physical environment of cities comes to shape human feeling and its associated behaviors, I want to stress that to whatever extent urban planners and designers and architects know this and attempt to prescribe human feeling and the practical usage or flow through space and place, there's an inescapable reality, which is that emotions and their associated behaviors and practices also shape these physical environments. And I think it's difficult, if not impossible, and certainly not desirable, to try to unravel this dynamic. So I don't think we should try. Now, while it's true, per Margaret Pernau in this oft-cited piece, that design space affords us a material glimpse into situated emotion, knowledge, and power, which is to say, we can understand the intent of emotional prescription through architecture. Every space, nonetheless, affords a variety of experiences, whether as resistance to the emotional prescription or whether in complete ignorance of it. What I call here the vicissitudes of affordance mean that spaces will be used as they are used and not necessarily as they're meant to be used. And of course, built spaces often outlive the emotion, knowledge, or the emotional regime that inspired them. So while emotions, as Joe Ben Prestel points out, allow us to a way to understand the embodiment of the social, there is in the city to an equal extent a socialization and a materialization of the body and mind. Now, the other book here, Till Grossman and Philip Nielsen's book on emotional democracy, architecture of democracy, they pursue all these points when they acknowledge that built environments are, quote, materializations of conceptual and tacit emotional knowledge that can alter their own presuppositions. Planning, constructing, and using architecture cannot be ordered into simple juxtaposition of the planner's intentions versus the perception of buildings. Buildings were constructed to match, enable, and discipline the historic bodies of those imagined living in or with them. But analogous to the naming of emotions, buildings can transform the arrangements they originated from, reshape emotional dynamics, and create their own unintelligibility, end quote. The dynamic here described is inherently unstable. And I think that Grossman and Nielsen come closest to capturing it, presenting an either-or model of an architectural history of emotions or an emotional history of democracy. I think this tension is productive, and I wonder if they could do it over, how the contributors to this volume would have responded to the challenge, not of writing either or, but of writing both at the same time. The mere stuff of life, from books to furniture, from buildings of all kinds to the means of traversing spaces, has an effect on the brain. to live according to the logics of urban technology, urban architecture, and urban stuff is to live in a neurodynamic environment. So it's not just that people who come to a city adapt to a different space, but the city itself, never static, involves constant disruption and adaptation. The city is a site of dynamic formation. Culture produces experience, human activity produces culture, and so on. People make cities, which being made, make humans. So in some ways, the city makes this dynamic formation, this constant instability, visible and intelligible. And in that sense, it becomes a primary source. So I quite like the idea, on the one hand, that the brain is thought of not as a coherent ancient organ of the self, but as a kind of messy assemblage, which is part of a system that's not bounded by the skin. And I quite like the idea that the city is also a kind of assemblage in the same way, a messy system. It's not bounded by maps or by topography. It seems to be organic. And these two messy assemblages, they're entangled with each other, but they don't mirror each other. They are mutually productive. They're co-constitutive with each other. So with this in mind, I think it's useful and productive to pursue the tension that's characteristic of this kind of system and which lies at the heart of experience. It seems as if it emanates from the streets, from the buildings, from the cafes, from the mere presence of different types of people. But it isn't reducible to any one of them. But it's almost tangible. And of course, it's different in each place and in each time that you would care to look. The experience of the city can't be located in the subjective or the intersubjective if the materiality and the spatiality of emotional practice, and I guess I would add here the materiality and spatiality of sensory, epistemological, and belief practices, are not factored into the equation. Those who have theorized contact zones and the emotional frontier have shown that what it means to be and to feel human are connected to an implicit awareness of power that flows through the prescribed association of specific social, sensorial, emotional, and bodily practices to the use designation of specific spaces. And it makes sense to me to emphasize the spatial quality of what William Reddy called emotional navigation. William Reddy is like an ancient of the history of emotions by now, but his stuff is still rewarding. So there are feeling rules for different types of urban space. It's important to know where those rules come from, but it's also important to know how people come to know them. And just as important, we have to inquire about those who either do not know the feeling rules or those who know the feeling rules but can't easily navigate them, people who feel out of place, in place. Inappropriate use of space has experiential consequences at the individual and collective levels. And examples of inappropriate behavior often point us precisely both to the agencies that politicize space and their methods of enforcement. The orthodoxy of collective experience is often revealed most clearly in the breach. So while Margaret Purno qualifies the ways that city planning aims at the creation of emotions with the additional claim that such planning is based on emotion knowledge specific to a certain time and place, where a physical reality is constructed so that it stabilizes, perpetuates this emotion knowledge, I want to add some caveats. Prescriptive intent is limited only to the group implicated or valued by the designer. The emotional experience of the excluded in such space is always, doubtless, different, somewhat fraught perhaps. Moreover, neither political dynamics nor cultural configurations are stable, resulting in changes in the ways design spaces are perceived, sensed, and felt. So, I mean, I take the opportunity to be inspired by Sara's work. Go read the book if you haven't yet. I'm sure you all have. Of course you have. But I think this argument which she's sustaining, which shows that colonialist intentions and practices of medical missionary power were really complicatedly interwoven with local uses of built space. Not only was local knowledge and local design incorporated into buildings themselves, but the building's specific location in the landscape and its specific smells and sounds and materiality could render them part of local culture. Places that, intentions notwithstanding, came to belong to the culture that they were designed to appropriate or colonize or convert or whatever. The process can't ever have been said to have been complete. I think that's really important. But this kind of line of argument should warn anybody off too easy an understanding of the relation between prescription and experience, and I think, crucially, time. Now, Sara Ahmed famously argued all the way back in 2004, very sophisticatedly. It always amazes me that she's not cited more by historians of emotions, because frankly, theoretically, she's far in advance of many in the field. She argued that, quote, emotions do things and work to align individuals with collectives or bodily space with social space through the very intensity of their attachments. So she's focused on how feelings make the collective appear as if it were a body in the first place. That is, how the collective takes shape through the impressions made by bodily others. So these are impressions, marks, indentations, points of contact, points that stick. These make the collective, but their opposites are formative of what is excluded, points that slip, miss, diverge. Now, to my mind, the bodily other, which she references, must include the material world that Andreas Reckwitz emphasizes in this adjacent article here. That is, those artifact space assemblages that form the material, where and how of emotional practices, or, as Ahmed puts it, emotions are about the intimate relationship between selves, objects, and others. Experience in the biocultural city, whatever it may feel like, perforce takes place in this relationship among subjective mind, individual body, mind bodies of others, and the physicality of space, producing, in Ahmed's terms, unstable surfaces and boundaries that comprise the politics of claims to identity, inclusion, and their opposites. But the temporal element is key, for within the instability are coherences that stick. Ahmed calls them histories that stick. And these coherences have a continuous presence in the ecology of peopled space. Feelings, Ahmed says, rehearse associations that are already in place, in the way in which they read the proximity of others at the same time as they establish the truth of the reading. By already in place, Ahmed means pre-existing. I'm inferring physically contained in the environment, literally built. Broadening Ahmed's focus on emotions into experience, I surmise that the politics of experience, perceived perhaps as the atmosphere of the city, are woven into its biocultural fabric. But this insight is hardly new. George Simmel in 1903 on the Metropolis and Mental Life was, quote, struck by how novel physical environments, new urban architectural forms, new systems of transportation, new types of consumption, new practices of everyday life were taking shape in expanding cities, reshaping urban citizens in body and soul. Now, obviously, we moved on in terms of terminology. But I think there's a challenge here of the plastic brain in dynamic relation with the plastic body, the brain bodies of others, and the worlds in which they are situated. And it still looms large for historians and beyond. And so far, hardly anybody amongst historians has taken the inactivist approach, which understands the vicissitudes of affordance in the material environment. Now, Rose and Fitzgerald can confidently talk about a relationship between an open neurobiology and a new sociology, where, quote, dualistic notions are simply irrelevant, and where the human brain is molded not only by the long timescale of evolution, but also by the short timescale of an individual life, by changing ways of living, by novel sites and practices of human inhabitation. And I ask, well, okay, good for you. Can historiography do that? I think it can, but so far it hasn't. In my view, historians remain deeply, fundamentally, implicitly attached to the conception of the universal human, and that's a real roadblock. Why? Well, the overwhelming allure of an orthodox, pop psychological vocabulary of basic emotions and canonical five senses fundamentally thwarts attempts to disrupt assumptions about historical lived experience. Moreover, it's quite hard, and I know this intimately, to find a functional multidisciplinary research initiative between the humanities and the neurosciences that might work as a model for a relationship between neuroscientists and historians. So coming back to these books here, Grossman and Nielsen's appraisal of neuroarchitecture, for example, is hardly encouraging. There is great moment in the study of the way humans' perceptions of space changes when their bodily states change. But the relationships between body, mind, and space are ahistorical. They're recreatable in the laboratory and predicated on the assumption that while space can change, human affects are automatic and autonomic, based on anciently evolved mechanics. And while I've found the disciplinary politics in the broad church of psychology to be deeply frustrating, the intransigence of historians to the possibilities of new kinds of collaboration and entanglement is quite confounding. This intransigence often comes from the place of resistance to the idea that neuroscience has anything to offer history, as if historians can only ever be the borrower. But my intention has always been to be the lender. I want to give something to neuroscience. I don't just want to take. I certainly don't want to knuckle under to it. The social neuroscientific insistence on social and cultural mediation of sensory and emotional experience has brought them to the point where they feel like they need to invent the humanities. And I want to wave a flag and say, we exist already. And they haven't fully realized what this must commit them to in terms of treating what they call usually the human exterior, that is the world, with the same degree of sophistication with which they approach the human interior, or indeed of smashing that dualism as well. So this is why it seems on the face of it that Rose and Fitzgerald's collaboration is quite momentous. And I think it's something that historians can augment. After all, if you read this book, they provide a survey of sociological thought concerning urban experience in modernity, from Mayhew to Benjamin, from Engels to Booth and Rowntree, from Simmel to Du Bois. Perhaps I think as they're making a genealogy for their own approach. These are forerunners of themselves. But it's ripe for forensic analysis by historians because they don't actually explore the contents of historical experience or propose a method for so doing. They point to an awareness among these theorists of urban modernity that the city taught, quote, new kinds of citizens how to experience themselves, and that to access the psyche of modernity, one needed to understand the city. But this only points us to the theorists. It doesn't actually solve the problem of experience itself, which is actually what they're interested in the present and for the future. So they've created a model for now and yet to come, but in so doing, I think they have stated the problem for historians. So while Rose and Fitzgerald are forceful in their insistence that, quote, questions of ecology, of biology, of vitality itself need to be the central urban questions of our age, I think these questions are historically applicable, and I feel compelled to say temporal dimensions should be part of the contemporary analysis as well. The need's clear to me, but blind spots are going to remain unless historians point them out rather bluntly. Social neuroscientists have shown that context is vitally important in the development of every human life. Since historians demonstrate that contexts change, don't we have a direct role to play in the production of knowledge about human experience? The world is built in the name of perceived reality, and perceived reality flows through what's already built. This approach allows us to try to reconcile the cultural and institutional structuration of experience with the constant disruptive movement of humans through it. It allows us to understand framings of collectivity that go beyond the community, or even a notion of shared experience, to see how life is intersubjectively and intermaterially lived. A greater engagement with questions of space, place, materiality, and the environment, however it is built, shaped, or otherwise conceptualized, helps us understand the ways in which people and other things touch, impress, build, stick, destroy, and live within and through them. The historical lived experience of the biocultural city should be on our agenda, and it should be within our grasp. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Should I go? Thank you, Rob, for this very, very rich talk. I have to go and listen back again. I have a few questions. I don't know if I should start or if someone else wants to go first, ask any question. So I'm going to go first. I just want to ask about specifically about collective experience. It's also something that I have becoming more not interested in, but just thinking about how important it is, just how it's possible to think about it, especially in relation to architecture or space. And I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about it, also because like you have in the book on feeling disease, you and I forgot her name. You talk about yes. You talk in detail about the collective experience and how the historians' emotions have left it out from their examination. So I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So, well, we just had in March conference here at Hex was on collective experience, and I was really pleased. Piroshka Nudge came from Montreal to give one of the keynotes and opened up by pointing out that collective experience and collective emotion actually not only have been left out of historiography, but they've also largely been left out of social psychology and sociology. And there are these great holes in our understanding which stem from, on the one hand, the location of the modern Western self in the notion of the individual subject, and the sort of long-standing division between reason and emotion, where the action of a crowd, say, fueled by emotion, with completely ambiguous understanding of how that emotion works in a crowd, could be written off as something outside of what is interesting to researchers, because it's A, unreasonable, and B, not located in the subject. And it seemed to me that there was a further compounding problem, which is that as historians, especially historians of emotions, they've been really interested in emotions on a societal level, whether it's the nation or various scales of community, and yet their primary building block is still the subject. So you talk about emotional communities, you talk about motions in crowds, you talk about motions in revolutions or whatever. Ultimately, you source it through individual accounts. And there's something fundamentally missing in the analysis there. When you start to ask questions of it anew, and when you reject, to begin with, the idea of the madness of the crowd, and you start to understand collective emotion as potentially at least intentional, productive, useful, and something causative, that is, it can bring about change with intention, then suddenly this becomes a huge challenge for which we don't have too much of a working theory. And so a few of us started to work on how you might reapproach the collective without assuming that collective experience means an intersubjective connection. Like, can I have an experience with other people without knowing them, without losing my mind? And obviously the answers to these things are yes. And it leads us in part to, well, what is driving these connections? It's in part, it's media, it's materiality, it's the spaces through which people move, it's access to things that people hold in common, even if that doesn't shape their identity, like a set of concepts, language, a confession, whatever it is. But I think there's a theoretical and methodological hole in what we do, which has been left there because people have flocked, quite understandably, to the convenience of things like emotional communities and the emotional regime to guiding theories in the history of emotions, the study of which privileges either direct connection between people, or else it's sourced through individual experiences of it. And it's difficult to kind of really get a hold of what a mass feeling looks like, feels like, how it works, how contagion works, how it spreads, so on. So I think that this analysis here, well, it's not really an analysis, it's a theoretical starting point, suggests a different kind of approach to what a source might be, to get at something beyond the subject.
I have a question kind of related to that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you're talking about the sources, right, as the actual like theoretical issue of this. So the issue is not so much conceptual or methodological as it is, I mean, it's a methodological issue of actually like primary sources then.
Yeah.
So like in the way you were talking about the let's say like the collaboration between like neuroscientists and historians, then there has to be also some sort of like collaboration between historians of like architecture, cities, and like material culture, right? Because people have been using like the city or like buildings as a primary source for a long time, but maybe not necessarily from the methods of like the history of emotions. And something you said during the talk really struck me, like you were talking about the brain and the city both being sort of these messy assemblages, and that they're entangled with each other, but they don't mirror each other. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what kind of sources are you foreseeing? Like maybe they don't mirror each other, but we have to look at the types of sources where it's apparent that they see each other, the brain and the city.
Yes. Okay. So 2 points. So one of the things that I didn't say but could have said is that in framing a turn to experience in this way, I and a bunch of my colleagues here are rejecting an old assumption of a different iteration of the history of experience, which was that by dint of historical insight, you could either recreate or re-experience what an historical actor had gone through. So these are things that spring from works of people like Dilthey and Collingwood in particular. And Collingwood, it was kind of like a magical process for him, where his own store of knowledge meant that he thought that given the right ingredients, he could simply, sitting at his desk, could re-experience what it was like for an historical actor to go through something in a particular place and time. And I think that that is a recipe for the historiography of the self as historian, and not particularly useful way of approaching historical experience, which, and here I'm using the insight from neuroscience to say that human formation taking place in context means that we have to assume the possibility that past human experience is nothing like mine or yours or whoever in the present. And so the first thing I have to do is cast aside any assumption that I can re-experience a thing. Now, this is difficult when it comes to buildings, right? Because you can say, okay, well, this building's been standing since 1492. I can go to it. Does going to it help you in any way get where you want to go? And the answer is not by itself, but you need an awful lot of other ingredients. So if you think about the long shopping list of factors that I began with when I talk about what's in play to do the history of experience, the building is a source, the city is a source, but it won't give anything up to you by itself. Whenever you isolate the time period that you're looking in, you also need all of the context from that time that you can find in order to try to rebuild an approximation of what it would have been like to be there then. Now, I thought, so in the book that Sara mentioned that I edited with Bettina Hitzer, Anne-Marie Adams had a chapter at the end, kind of, I mean, you know the chapter intimately, Cigdem, but it was an experimental chapter in which she was writing about the history, architectural history of a particular built space while sitting in that space. And I think what it did show, she has a double narrative. Part is what you might call traditional academic distance analysis, and part is in italics going, I'm actually sitting here. It's amazing. And I thought it was kind of honest, an honest approach to pointing out that there is a long way between where you are and where you want to be. The sort of, I think that there's a kind of temptation with built space to think that being there is somehow going to magically give you something of the place, and it won't. not without a lot of other things involved. So building or the city as source, yes, but you need lots and lots and lots of other types of source as well. The building or the city as a material space, just like any other source by itself, won't give you everything. So I said there were 2 points. Now I can't remember the second one. You asked me, what was it about neuroscience?
Maybe like the breadth of these sources, and yeah, the fact that like the brain and the city sort of interact with each other, but we need the types of sources where like actually like it points to this sort of interaction.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. So again, all I can do. So this is something that the neuroscientists are not interested in, though they should be, because I think it projects forwards as well as backwards. Which is that they posit a not a tabula rasa for the human brain and body, but rather a set of unwritten potentialities. So the one universal about the human brain is that it can be disrupted. It's built in context. It's plastic, so it responds to the environment. It responds through the environment, and it responds through culture and memory and so on of the intersubjective reactions around it from birth. Now, all I can do with that is say, okay, then I can't assume anything from my own formation makes sense in wherever I look in the historical record. All I can assume is that human development is taking place according to this law, which is one of situated potential, where the experience of any one individual or any one group is going to take place according to that context. And that means I'm looking for this dynamic and messy, unstable, not quite mirroring in a context. I'm always going to be guessing at the experience part, right? You've got 1,000 sources, all different kinds. You put them all together. Your results, the product of all of that analysis, is going to be partial, inevitably, and partial doubly. It's going to be only a part of the experience, and it's you can't resolve your positionality. But I think that that's honestly a truth of all historical analysis and narrative. That's our front, and anyone who claims that they've reached some position from nowhere is kidding. But I think that accepting partiality, that you can only ever get a bit of this messiness, we'll have to do.
Daniela?
Yes, I just need a minute to add myself here in this wonderful circle. I think now you can see me. I'm sorry if there was someone else in the having a question. I just jump in immediately. But first of all, thank you very much, Sara, to bring this wonderful group of scholars whose debates are, at least for me, still, from a very different perspective. I'm totally, let's say, not alien, but I would say not immersed in the debates. So I really appreciate Rob's first, let's say, attempt to share all the intellectual positions and recently, and some of them already 20 or 30 years old, and even before. So all the, let's say, to share this circle of scholars and positions and ideas, which is quite important. And I have two actually things. One is actually a comment. I was very much impressed. First of all, I agree that Sara Ahmed is an author that we have to study it much more. Also, in architecture history precisely. She's still very, let's say, very interesting groups of people who try to bring her, but sometimes in a very applicable way. And it is a pity to consider that. The second thing, I mean, continues that I was very much not surprised, but interested in when you were making a statement on the fact that, well, historians are still fundamentally worried or using it, the universal human, and which was quite an interesting statement because if we bring two architects and designers, although we architecture historians propose alternatives and positions, there is still, I would say, a dilemma or a crisis in which architects and designers fundamentally still practice the universal human, although in their design, in their designing practice, although orally or through a writing practice, one could say otherwise. So I would like to invite to have this, let's say, make this parallelism, because that's also, I think, I sympathize very much and I share with this position. So on one hand, we try to challenge it, but on the other hand, I mean, as architects and architecture historians, we try to challenge, but on the other hand, we haven't figured out alternatives, especially those who are practitioners. I also have problems with this term, but architects who practice and build and design, how they deal and cope with the question of the universal human. Yeah. And so that, I think, is quite interesting as a food for thought. But what I would like to hear also from you is that if you could elaborate a little bit more about Rose and Fitzgerald's urban brain. I mean, what is actually the book about? Because I was so curious to learn more. What is actually your interest? I could understand a bit of your interest in this book and a proposition to use it as a source while looking at the city. And maybe you can share with us.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
About and your reflections. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing the thing about architects. You know, most historians, when I say that historians are still firmly attached to the universal human, they deny it, but then they can't prove it. Whereas I've got lots of proof. And as for alternatives, well, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to I want to stay in my lane to some extent, although I'm usually in someone else's. But I think a little bit of critical reflexivity goes a long way. As for Rose and Fitzgerald, I'm wondering, yes, I have it here. So, I mean, they're interested in cities making us sick, and how that happens, and how you can how a combination of neuroscientific, social and cultural neuroscientific insight and sociological analysis might help you make a better city, like, you know, as a planner. And so their take is obviously very much present and future oriented, but I was excited principally by the way that these people in the humanities and social sciences are using a social neuroscientific insight and saying, what's the logical implication of this? If we are plastic and formed in context, then why the hell isn't this built into the ethical thinking for the way in which, like, designers design stuff? But you know, I'm always sort of looking backwards and thinking, you know, they have built this insight on the fact that a bunch of proto-social scientists in the 19th and early 20th century seem to understand something similar. But they didn't really pursue that at all. Like there's no, I mean, there's a nice survey of what these various figures said or did, but not any kind of pursuit of the effects. And to me, it would be really interesting, and it seems perfectly plausible to pursue the effects. And indeed, if you were to pursue the effects, then you would have even more of an empirical basis to make the claim that the way that places are designed and built has an effect on the brain and vice versa. So right now they've got a kind of neuroscientific insight coupled with a sociological approach. But for me, what the neuroscientific insight requires in order to be persuasive is more data, and not just crunching numbers in meta-analyses, which is what they often do. But, you know, historians can give them like tons of qualitative data that these insights are fundamentally true, and you can actually see materially what happens when you do things well or you do things badly, you don't think things through at all, or people use spaces in ways that they weren't supposed to, and so on and so on. So to me, yeah, it's just a really good launch pad for thinking about all the possibilities that are still out there, because I think it's safe to say that, I mean, I don't know so much about architectural history, though I have a feeling, but certainly true urban history has not particularly welcomed the history of emotions. There's been a bit of a wall there. But it strikes me that I don't want necessarily to enter into anybody's territory or redefine anything, but simply to say, okay, well, if you're not going to do it, like, we'll just do it for you, right? We need these sources, we need this insight. This is part of a much bigger story than any one particular niche of historiography. So I would hope to bring some people along with me, but if not.
Thank you. And thank you, Daniela. You mentioned what architects practicing with universal, but there are how many books I have come across on happy architecture, and they just make me so, I don't know, annoyed. I don't know if anyone else has any question.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm really not an expert in this field, so maybe my question will be super naive or even stupid, but I will try it. I was thinking, when you were talking about the partiality and messiness of like our way of re-experiencing or reenacting historical emotions, I was thinking that even in the present, people have problems in articulating their feelings. It's already a partial experience or a messy experience of our own emotions.
Yeah.
So the sources we do have of historical emotions are maybe only those of people who were able to articulate their emotions. So maybe there's some kind of double messiness or something. So I was just wondering, how do you deal theoretically with this?
Well, you're right, of course, and it leads to even more fundamental question of, well, when you talk about a person's emotions, well, where are they exactly? And now the sort of hardline psychologists would sort of go inwards, but my point is that a person's emotions always exist relationally. You can't have any without the cultural framework in which you're situated. And so that cultural framework is implicated in your emotions, even when you're by yourself. You can't emote outside of that culture and be a human being. And it's true that people don't necessarily understand or their own feelings, or they may not be able to articulate them or express them freely. And we have quite good developed theories for understanding what affords people more or less freedom in a given context to be apparently in touch with themselves, as it were, and to deal with people's feelings of authenticity, if you like, that which seems to come as if naturally and fittingly in a given time and space. So all those things are difficult in the present, and you're right, in the past that problem is compounded. But I would say, fortunately, that we are, unlike most of historiography, we're not limited to what people recorded in words. So if you think about just, in this context with this paper, thinking about an approach to built spaces, then you have all of the materials that go along with built space, architectural plans, designs. You have statues, paintings, sound recordings, film, all the objects that have been handled or not handled or whatever it is. So this is really there's never a moment for me where I resort to the evidence left in a text and think, I've got it, that's enough. That's usually a mistake, because what people record is always mediated to, and there's a real challenge to understanding how that mediation works. Even when it's recorded in a private diary, it's still speaking to something beyond that private moment.
Yes, just to respond with articulation, I didn't mean only text. I actually was thinking about the diversity of media.
Yeah,
but,
well, of course, there's a silence. There's the silences are profound and widespread, and it's a huge challenge. So often, I mean, historians often talk about reading between the lines or listening to the silences, and I always think, well, that's a neat conceit, but what do you actually mean? How do you listen to that silence? Exactly, please. But often, I think I talk about if you can understand the way a regime is constructed politically, then you can implicitly understand what's excluded from it, even if you can't see it. But the reason that historians are often drawn to moments of rupture, crises, revolution, riot, political upheaval, war, and so on, is it's often at this moment that the framing of a particular regime cracks, and you see at this moment explicitly what has been excluded, either fighting to get in or fighting to change the framework. It still only gives you an oblique glimpse of what it was like outside. And I think we have to be honest about how little you can say about what's outside. So the challenge is to interpret what happens when those breaches occur, and you start to see what's through the crack.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Something.
Sorry. Sorry, I have a sort of silly, quick question. So, what makes a history of the biocultural city different from that of the history of a city of biocultural agents? Because I quite like the way you frame it as the biocultural city.
Yeah, I suppose really the difference is a question of intent. So for me, my primary interest is the history of the human being. I see that the human being is not an animated sack of skin, right? It's connected to its environment, entangled with its environment, so that a history of the human can also include this history of its environment. I think it's perfectly valid if what you want to do is write the history of a city. That's a perfectly valid thing to pursue. It's just not as big a thing to pursue. And the risk, it always seems to me, is that you might treat it as an entity in and of itself. But without the humans in it, it's nothing. It just doesn't exist, right? Its meaningfulness is only in the experience of going through it. I mean, in a literal way, experiencing it. So that's what's driving me. But I am happy to admit that there are lots of ways to do the bits of these things, perfectly valid research inquiries and intentions that don't aim at quite such grandiose goals. But I like grandiose goals.
Anyone else has any questions? Sorry about my voice. Are we over time, Daniela? Yeah. So I could just going to end here. I want to thank you, Rob, again. It was a very rich presentation and also a discussion. I have many other questions, but later I will ask whenever I see you. And what I hope, just emphasizing what you mentioned, that we are going to, after this talk, hopefully we are going to have a few more architectural historians who are interested in history of emotions. That would be ideal. And thank you everyone for joining us, also for staying with us to the end. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.